Welcome to the podcast, Family Secrets of the Spanish Civil War. I'm Patricia Schechter, coming to you from Portland, Oregon. My guests today are Fred, Constancia, and David Warren, siblings raised by Alvin and Anna Warren, and they come from a family with very strong and interesting ties to left, labor, and anti-fascist politics, including the Spanish Civil War. Thank you all for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Why don't we go around and have each of you just introduce yourself and say just a couple words about you and your names.
I'll start.
Excellent. Thanks, Fred.
My name's Frederick Douglass Warren, and I'm here today at my home in Bellevue, Kentucky, on the south side of the Ohio River across from Cincinnati. I'm retired from working in the printing industry, and I'm named after the prominent abolitionist, former enslaved man, Frederick Douglass. A few summers ago, when I was leading a tour at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Cincinnati, I got to meet a great some descendant of Frederick Douglass.
Oh, wow.
And he was really interested to find my name being named after his ancestor.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Connie, go right ahead.
So I'm Constancia Warren. My parents were expecting to name their first child after Frederick Douglass. What they weren't expecting and didn't know until the last minute was that they were going to have twins. And so Fred got Frederick Douglass, and my parents decided to give me a name that recalled the Spanish Civil War. And the initial the initial idea was Dolores for Dolores Ibarruri La Pasionaria. But my mother looked up Dolores. She knew what it meant, that it meant sorrow. Dolor is pain. And so they named me after Constancia de la Mora, who was a woman who came from a very well-to-do Spanish family, very close to the crown, and who, during the Spanish Civil War, essentially broke with her family, broke with her class. And I believe ran the foreign press office in Barcelona.
That's right.
And wrote a wonderful memoir called In Place of Splendor. So I'm Constancia. And then my mother's father, upon hearing the names of these two children, said, you know, there were biblical heroes too. And that's David.
Go right ahead, David. Thank you.
Well, that tells the story of my name, which Connie just gave, which I only had gotten from hearsay. And I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm a chef, and that's what I do every day.
Fabulous.
And I neglected to say that I'm in Croton-on-Hudson, which is 35 miles north of New York City, and is also an interesting village that has both an artistic and a left-wing history. And is not too far from where we grew up.
Yes, indeed. And not too far from where I grew up, which is part of the fun of making the connection with you all. I'm so excited and really grateful for your time today. I will put a link in the program for the podcast so that folks who listen can find more information about Alvin Warren and his service in the Spanish Civil War. But Alvin Warren was born Alvin Cohen in 1913 in Brooklyn, New York. And, just in brief, was drawn to labor and working class politics from his youth. He attended a number of labor colleges as a young man. He worked as a CIO organizer in Lower Westchester County. I was very pleased to hear of his protesting anti-communist films being shown in New Rochelle, taking on the police who were very, giving the side eye to these protesters. But Alvin Warren was born Alvin Cohen, and I know there's an important family story about the name change, and I'd love to have you share it with our listeners today.
So the name change comes from his older brother, from whom also he got some of his politics, because it was his brother Norman who first introduced him to left-wing politics. He had a consciousness raised by his experiences when he was riding the rails and hanging around with young people who might otherwise be described as ne'er-do-wells. But during the Depression, Norman's wife, Rose, was an early woman executive in the textile industry. And the employment agency with which she was linked sent her out on a job interview, and she was told there was no job. And when she came back and told the agency, they said, yeah, well, there was a job, but you have the wrong name.
Wrong
And
last name.
wrong last name, because they weren't hiring Jews during the Depression. So Norman and Rose were the ones who initiated the name change to Warren. Daddy went along with it, and so did both of his sisters, who then married and changed their names to their husbands' names. But it was that whole generation did in fact change the name to Warren.
Wow, well, it's a powerful story, and for me as a historian, it's great to have these stories because, when we do research and we look in documents and census records, in marriage records and military records, and people go and change their names, it makes our job very difficult. But so there's just always more to know about these things. I'll just share back that my Italian relatives, my father's mother's people, came from Italy around the turn of the 20th century, and their last name is Graziani from southern Italy. And it really divided their family when her older brothers, my grandmother was the next to youngest of six, and her older brothers, who had great aspirations to be doctors and engineers and such, they felt the name Sgrazioni was too ethnic, too, really at the time racializing. And they changed it to Stewart. So my grandmother, they went Dutch, exactly. Well, it was New York, right? And so, but it really divided the family. And in fact, when the patriarch and matriarch passed, Eduardo and Zita Rosa Sgrazioni, my grandmother took on her older brothers to make sure that the mausoleum had the name Sgrazioni on it, not Stewart.
Wow.
So, so these things can really divide families, but what's really, again, quite consistent with my impression of Alvin and your whole family is that there's this sort of solidarity and sense of shared purpose that is really striking. It's really striking.
Well, and of course, it extends beyond just our immediate family because my mother's sister married a man who went to Spain and fought in the Spanish Civil War with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and my father's sister married similarly. So in addition to our father, we had two uncles, one on each side of our family, who also fought in Spain.
I have a quick question, and I should know this, but Connie, was she Constancia Joan, or did Joan come from somewhere else? I don't remember.
No, it's a funny story. I think the story that I was told was that they had the name Constancia. They didn't have a candidate for a middle name, but they thought since Fred had a middle name, Douglas, that I would feel left out if I didn't have a middle name. And Joan was, according to my memory, the labor room nurse. They just put it down in order to put something down. So it had no meaning. And
that makes sense.
About 60 years ago, I dropped it legally.
Oh,
there you go.
Yeah.
Thereby confusing researchers in the future, I might add. No, I'm just teasing. Just teasing. No, that's a lovely story. That's a lovely story.
Right.
Well, and I appreciate this theme that Fred has accented around not just the solidarity of your immediate family, but a kind of an extended kin group, extended family. And maybe that's a good segue to, my first question around, kind of setting the stage for your childhood in Montrose, New York, in the 1950s, and what that was like, and what the strong kind of memories and spirit of your early childhood was like in that environment.
This is Connie's cue to explain why we wound up in Montrose rather than Croton.
I will, but Fred has pointed out, I think quite astutely, that was really the first time that we were, although maybe the house before that a little bit, where we were in a situation where we knew other kids, because Daddy was sort of being sought by the FBI during the height of the McCarthy era. They had chosen to live in places that weren't near other families. And so Fred and I were each other's playmates, and basically until we got to elementary school. So my parents had friends in Croton.
Right.
My father had had a very difficult relationship with his mother, but he had a kind of surrogate mother and a woman named Elizabeth Moose, who lived in Croton, who was an educator, had founded an early progressive school called the Hessian Hill School. And during the Spanish Civil War, she was one of a group of people who took in wounded or unwell Spanish Civil War vets. And since
Right.
Daddy got sent home ill, um, it was Elizabeth who took him in, and he formed a bond with her adolescent son. Um, and uh, and I think Joe North may already have been her neighbor at that point, left-wing journalist. And so
Mm.
that was the connection to Croton. But
Yeah.
the point at which my parents went to look for houses, the houses in Montrose were less expensive, and the
Right.
schools at that point were actually better than those in Croton because Montrose had a small corner where there were Columbia University professors, mainly from Teachers College, and their kids were roughly the same age we were. And so the parents exerted real pressure on the public school system. So they
Right.
bought a house in Montrose where we were one of like 3 or 4 Jewish families in the entire area.
Right.
I can remember the Rackows, the Gilmans, Barbara Greenfield, and us. That was it. And there were
Wow.
no other left-wing families. And so it was a very isolating way to grow up.
Mm. Yeah.
And that was sort of amplified by the fact that Fred and I were both very strong students. So there was sort of nerdy kids.
You stood out. You
We
stood
stood
out
out.
at school. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's really fascinating to think about that part of the lower Hudson River Valley, that East Coast there, the eastern shore of it, if you will, that Croton being kind of quite explicitly leftist. They claim John Reed, even though John Reed was
right.
born out here in Portland, but they claim John Reed as a Crotonian. Then Montrose is this kind of middle space, and then my hometown, just what, 3 miles north,
Right.
in sequence of Peekskill, which is very conservative, very Catholic, and perhaps most infamously the site where Paul Robeson almost lost his life in 1949 before a concert of his. A riot broke out, anti-communist flavored, uh, basically lynch mob kind of broke out. And I wonder, my parents were able to get a house quite inexpensive. That's why they landed there. Peekskill might have been cheaper than Montrose, but I got to go look up the pricing from back in
Something
the
that
day.
is.
I
But
wanted to, I wanted to add something too, because you mentioned the Paul Robeson. I didn't mention
yeah,
it. And this again, I'm not sure this is true, but we lived, it was the Tri-Town area, Montrose, Buchanan, and Verplanck.
right,
Planck was a very, very right-wing Italian Catholic area, and well, really, there were two things with Verplanck. One was we knew a black family that were, as far as I know, the only black family that ever tried to move into Verplanck, and
wow.
their house was set on fire, and they
Oh
moved
my
out.
word.
But also, I also had remember hearing that during the Robeson affair, that Verplanck actually set up barricades at the edges of the town to keep the commies from the Robeson concert somehow coming in.
From invading.
Wow.
The
Yes.
other small factotum about Verplanck is that it is actually where Mel Gibson is from.
Yes.
Oh,
And he and his father
interesting.
were both ultra right. I think they
Right.
say they're from Peekskill, but they were actually from Verplanck.
And
Interesting. Right. They claim Peekskill quite
Right.
proudly. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder about the economic space as well. I know they lost a lot of factory jobs and there was a kind of contraction after the war. So it was
One big thing that they lost in Verplanck was the gravel quarry,
right.
which I just was stimulated to look that up online and read the history of it recently because I was listening to a Zoom lecture which mentioned quarries, and I was always so impressed with the water in the quarry.
wasn't
Yeah.
there also was a brickworks, I
The
believe.
brickworks were, in fact, in Montrose. They
Interesting.
Oh, I
were
thought
at
they
at
were
the end
right.
of Dutch Street and even I think across the road from us.
Interesting. Yeah, I
Oh,
think
I didn't.
Peekskill had a Fleischmann's
Right. You could
factory.
smell
I
it.
was.
You could smell the yeast when you drove by.
Say a little bit more about your family life, about Alvin's role in your shaping of your childhood, and Anna's too as well. What it meant to grow up in a committed leftist family in these at least mixed right times in 50s in Lower Hudson Valley.
Well, one thing that we affected us greatly, I think, was my parents' choice of music. In particular,
Mm,
my father had recordings of the songs of the Spanish Civil War. In fact, I have one in my basement that I inherited from him that was Pete Seeger singing, I think, the songs of the Spanish Civil War.
right on.
And also Paul Robeson. I have and actually recently, a few weeks ago, I took out of the local library released last year 16 Robeson CDs set that I
Wow.
really enjoyed
Wow.
listening to. So there was that cultural input that we got from my parents' enjoyment of that kind of music, and it was played quite often when we had visitors who
Mm,
had connections to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, for instance.
And that, my parents' friends weren't particularly local. I mean, they were sometimes we would see people from Croton, although that would be, I think almost more often we would go to Croton to see Elizabeth and see the Norths.
mm,
Um, but locally, for the most part, it was people coming up to visit, and it was like Mo Fishman and Steve Nelson. And Steve at one point later on, I think when we were in high school, actually lived with us for a while during the week while he and Daddy were building a house in their effort to
wow.
create a construction business for the two of them.
Wow.
On that note, I just remembered too that Daddy's he had a construction or a company that I don't know if he didn't incorporate it, but it was Margan Builders, which
Right,
wasn't named after Steve's wife and mom, because
right. It
wasn't.
was it was Margaret Nelson and Ann Warren. So Morgan
Oh,
Builders was the name. That was the name of their company.
oh, that's
Yeah.
great.
So
That's
we
great.
were surrounded by
Yeah.
um sort of memories and heard their conversations. I mean, we were sent to a kind of non-religious Jewish cultural Sunday school, the Jewish community of Cortland, where we didn't learn anything about the religion at all. I had to learn a lot later on. But what we did learn was Jews in world history, Jews in American history, and Jewish cooking, which mommy taught at least part of the time.
Oh, how lovely.
So
That's really powerful. And let's see. So you kind of assimilated slowly this sort of heritage of the Spanish Civil War. How did your dad place himself uh for your ears, for at the kitchen, more at the kitchen table? What stories stuck out about him and his service?
You didn't really tell very many stories.
he's told lots of stories, but not about Spain.
Well, fair enough.
Yeah,
Well,
but he
fair
told a
enough.
lot of stories. I mean, he basically ran away from home as an early adolescent.
Right.
He was, I mean, in current special ed lingo, he'd be gifted special ed, extremely bright, out of control. And he was in trouble with school authorities before he was enrolled in school. Um,
Wow, really? How did he manage that?
what he says is he would stand at the window and make faces at the kids on the inside. That was the story that he told. And one of his sisters sent me some of his report cards. I have a couple of report cards, and you can see in the comments the frustration of the teacher confronted with this kid who's clearly bright but won't work and won't behave. So, he said he had a junior high school diploma, but he said his father bought it for him. He didn't he never really finish. And so he ran away and rode the rails, and there were lots of stories associated with that we heard.
Yeah, I mean,
Either directly telling us, about stealing potatoes and wrapping them in foil and putting them in the campfire
Wow.
or things like that.
Is that why he got arrested and put on a chain gang? I have to bring this story up because it's when you brought it to my attention, I'm like, this one we have to
So
amplify.
that was a little bit later. I mean, the initial running away was when he was still fairly, I think he was 13, and his parents were taking him to a psychologist at Bellevue.
Wow.
And the psychologist recommended that he go to this camp that was run by a boxer, a Jewish light heavyweight boxer.
Wow.
And because daddy was big for his age, he got beaten up constantly.
Mhm.
So he ran away. The first time he ran home to Mount Vernon, which is where they were living then. And the psychologist said, send him back. And then the second time he ran away, he ran north, and he was taken in by a farmer in Maine. He spent the remaining months of the summer working on a farm in Maine
Amazing.
and returned at the end of the summer to find out that his older brother had just been killed in a car accident,
Oh.
probably drunk driving associated,
Mm.
since the family did have issues with alcohol. So he was already, on his way out of the house.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so
And then made his
so
way south, I understand.
he made his way south. So that was his first trip. And then later he became friends with a man who eventually married his older sister and became our uncle, John Matson. And Red was a hothead. And when they were arrested for loitering, Red resisted arrest would probably be the polite way to put it. And so they ended up on a chain gang.
He left home, if I remember correctly. I thought I remember him saying that his older brother used to beat the shit out of him constantly.
That was the one that got killed, Eugene, I think.
Wow.
I
Right?
think.
I think,
No,
I don't know whether it was Eugene or whether it was Norman.
No, it was Eugene was the one who died, and I
Yeah,
thought Eugene.
Eugene was the one who died. Yeah.
I find it interesting that I didn't know about this story about him working a summer in Maine.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
When I was, I think, 22 years old, I lived on Mount Desert Island and worked a summer in Maine as well as a carpenter's helper.
Wow.
I remember at one point when mommy and daddy went to Maine without us, they went and they tracked down the farmer and they saw him.
Oh,
Who
really?
was very poor, and I mean, I have a memory that they then, tried to reconnect, or at least to retrace that part of his history. I mean, the story that he tells, in the oral history video of this fight with this African American kid, where they got into a fight, and then when they met up, they were surrounded by people saying, kill the nigger, kill the Jew,
Oh, boy.
and realized that they had more in common than they had apart, that
Wow.
separated them. So I think that his political consciousness started earlier, and then was developed.
I think that he was introduced to Gorky in the Merchant Marine.
Wow.
How
Okay. That's a
so?
great footnote.
That's a story I didn't hear.
It's somewhere in the recesses of my mind.
I mean,
Wow.
he was, I have books with that he bought
Yeah.
on all kinds of things. And I mean, as much as he was not religious at all, there's a book on the wisdom of Maimonides, that has a 32 Bank Street stamp in it, which is where he lived at one point. I mean, the story that I remember from his being on the chain gang was how he became an atheist, which was because he was tall and he had big feet, and they didn't have prison shoes the size of his feet, and he had boots. And because he had boots, they couldn't shackle him. And they did shackle Red, and I remember being told that until the day he died, Red had scars on his ankles from the shackles.
Wow.
And so as a result, they beat him. And they probably beat him anyway. I mean, whether he had the shackles on or not. And so he told the story once that, it was so bad that one night he went to bed praying to God that if you're there, please don't let them beat me in the morning. And they beat him in the morning. And that was the last he ever had to do with anything called God. So
I also seem to remember, and this again could be false memory that he was also, when he was on the road as a young kid, that he was lived in a brothel for a
That
short
one I
time?
don't remember.
Okay, I just vaguely remember hearing that.
I
Yeah.
remember there's in one of his stories that he had something to do, met up with people in a circus and did some
Yes.
work in a circus.
Yeah. Well, I think these are the kinds of things that could be true and false. I mean, they're sort of
So,
classic, they're sort of classic ways that people who are on the road pick up work,
right.
and so it's both, it's likely, even if it didn't happen, something very similar did, that you're sort of, you're in a place for 24 hours. So you agree, I'll take out the trash. I'll sweep the yard. I'll,
Right.
clean up the animal barn, for in exchange for a meal or so, a few dollars. So it doesn't surprise me. Um,
So I mean, one of the other stories that I remember was one from when he was traveling the rails across the north. And it was something that took place in Minot, North Dakota, which was that the people, there was during the Depression and people were starving, and that they
right.
sort of massed and made a movement toward a food market. And he got shot by a railroad dick, as he puts it, railroad
Wow.
policeman. And
Wow.
he was taken in by the brakeman, who took pity on him, and he was a man, he and his wife were a childless couple, an older couple, and they became very fond of Daddy, and they offered to adopt him, which he had no interest in. He
Oh
said
my
as he
word.
said, he had one set of parents was quite enough. He didn't need another.
Well, again, that rings so true because we know both from the blues, from the songs of the day and from oral histories that people who were riding the rails, you needed to be friendly with the trainmen
Right.
because those were the ones who they could hide you, they could put you here, they could put you there. So that's again just strikes me as ringing true. But again, this embellishment around the adoption is just it's just hard. It just touches the heart.
Right.
Um,
So I
yeah,
would like to just introduce the fact as well that our mother also came from a progressive background.
right.
Her parents had a summer resort in the Catskills that catered to old left people, are, just many people sitting around playing pinochle. And
Right on.
and she was very active politically herself. She had been in the teachers union in New York City. And then later, when we were growing up, she was active in Women's Strike for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Oh, how wonderful. So Anna Warren, née Hamburger,
Right.
and she was a teacher, right? And did she
She was
teach?
a teacher, and she was part of something called the Teachers Union, not the UFT,
Oh,
which it
wow.
was a left-wing union that was red baited out of existence, and the UFT then came to dominate.
Got it.
And
Got it.
and she could not have been more of a diametrically opposite kind of relationship to academia than my father, because my mother went to Hunter College, I think at the age of 16,
Right.
and
Wow.
majored in French and biology
No,
or
no, chemistry.
chemistry and something else. And
Yeah.
so, and she was
I think it was chemistry and physics, actually.
really, she was a very
Wow.
bookish person, and eventually had a career as a copy editor for the condensed books of the Reader's Digest. But so,
In Pleasantville.
In
Yes,
Pleasantville.
which was
My
a bone.
aunt's husband worked there. Yeah, that
I
was a,
worked in the post office at Pleasantville, sorting returned condensed books.
oh my goodness. David, did you want to chime in?
No, I just say that the fact that she worked at the Reader's Digest was sort of under a bone of contention, somewhat because Reader's Digest has that sort of right-wing background. So she was there to make a living, and that was it.
Well,
Yeah.
we never had a copy of the magazine in the house. We only had the
We
books.
only had the condensed books, right?
Yeah,
And
we got,
it was a perfect job for her because she was a voracious reader. And so
mm,
her job was to take the manuscripts that had been cut and make sure that it flowed and that nothing essential had been left out, as well
fantastic.
as to do standard copy editing as well. But
Wow.
I mean, when she was in her mid 90s, she would read the New York Times with a pencil in her hand, and she got the New York Times from time to time on mistake.
Wow. That's fantastic. I love that. Oh my word. Yeah, our house we had the atlases, the Reader's Digest atlases, so lots of maps. And I have to credit the Reader's Digest. My dad was loved ragtime, so he was a Scott Joplin guy. He played ragtime. We had a very narrow, but that's what he liked, and classical. But it was the Reader's Digest American Standards that actually introduced me to jazz, the LPs.
Mm.
I hadn't heard Billie Holiday.
Yeah.
I hadn't
wow.
heard Louis Armstrong, and so it was the Reader's Digest American Standards that introduced them. I hope my dad still has them.
Yeah.
So let's have one more story about Anna and Alvin, and then we'll take a little break and come back and talk a little bit about the war. How did they meet?
They
These
met at the
two.
Communist Party, and I believe that Daddy turned to somebody and said, "I'm going to marry that woman." He was taken, and they got married 6 weeks later. I mean, they got married after a 6-week courtship,
But
and were then married.
parenthetically, for neither of them was it a first marriage,
Right, they both had.
but they both had marriages that were annulled previously.
Right.
Got it.
And
Right.
everybody in the family has had a trial marriage, including
Right.
the
The longest marriage among the 5 of us was 18 months.
Okay.
So we run
Practice,
from
practice, practice.
like
That's how you get to
long enough
Carnegie Hall.
right.
That's fabulous. So when you
And we
say
all
they
had
met,
very long second marriages.
right on. Well, and you say they met in the party. So at an organizing meeting, at a celebration, a rally.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I think my mother was signing people up, and he met her, and he was taken by her. She was not his first person of that kind of quality. At one point, I was contacted by a woman who had letters from Daddy, who was prior to Mommy, and she was a concert pianist. And she had and I eventually gave the letters to the archives, but
Wow. So
yeah.
he was being sought after.
Well, no, well, either that or his taste in women was women who were quite smart and accomplished.
Wow. That's so vivid.
Despite the fact that he
wonderful.
was, a junior high school dropout, he was a larger than life commanding presence. He was good looking and he was charming.
And clearly a person
And he was a wonderful
resilience.
raconteur. I mean, he loved telling stories.
In terms of what parts of of Alvin's story about military service, but we'll start with the Spanish Civil War. His oral history is so vivid and so interesting. And I was really struck when he said in both of his military turns, both in the Spanish Civil War and later in World War II for the U.S. Army, that he was sort of robbed of his basic training. And he really wanted to serve as a soldier.
Right.
And yet he had this really interesting skill set and also his larger than life personality that it kind of prevented him from serving in the way he wanted to. So, when he shows up in Spain in 1937, he's assigned to this truck detail, transportation detail. And he and his friend get very upset. They say, "We didn't come all the way to Spain to be chauffeurs." So it's just a wonderful.
And he's resolutely proletarian.
Yeah, it was just a wonderful image. I just wondered if you had a little more to share about that, or if any of that came through. The sense that he went to serve for a specific purpose, but had to sort of fight the man, if you will, to carry it out.
I don't know that he didn't talk about that. It almost makes me wonder if that's part of the reason that he didn't talk as much about Spain.
Yeah.
Was that he felt like he had never been in as much danger, or been as tested as the others who were on the front lines. But at that point, by the time he signed up, he was 23 years old. He was a seasoned organizer.
Right.
And he had both organizational and political skills that were needed, at headquarters. And so he got grabbed up and and used differently.
Right.
So he
Well,
was, I wouldn't say immortalized, but when Vincent Sheehan wrote about him as being his chauffeur, driving him, I guess, to the Ebro battlefront.
wow.
Yeah,
Wow, that's really powerful. Well, I mean, funnily enough, right, what he does say, he doesn't say, I had great admin skills, so they,
right,
what he
right.
actually sort of brags about, if you will, I mean, small b, is this, caper he and a friend pull off to commandeer trucks from Madrid and get them down to Albacete, where they're stationed, because there's a shortage. And he tells a great story about hijacking a number of trucks from a storage area and planning, casing the joint and pulling this off, and then he and his colleagues driving these trucks south, and then repainting them, giving them new numbers so that they camouflage their pilfering of this supply of trucks. And he says it was kind of a gangster operation, so far from trumpeting
Right.
his organizing skill. And he says, with a chuckle, he says, well, being crooks ourselves, of course we pulled
Right.
this off in grand style. And so kind of unforgettable sort of story. But I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that or
So,
reflect on if any of
so
that came through.
when he was a kid, when we would hear from him and from his sisters that his mother would say, "Alvin, you're going to die in the electric chair." I mean, because he was so uncontrollable and
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 fearless.
delinquents.
delinquent and getting into trouble. I mean, the trucks were stolen from the French, who had lots of trucks where the Americans didn't. And apparently, Andre Marty, who was the head of the French Communist Party, threatened to have him executed and had to be talked out of
Wow.
it. So, they did. I think they did get caught, um,
Well, I think the way he
or
tells it,
at least found
I
out.
didn't know. I don't know if they got caught, but he tells it that one of the higher ups knew and was sort of shaking his finger at them. It's like, we're
Right,
gonna, you
right,
did
and
this,
that
and we're
that
gonna
came
get you.
back to bite him later when he had disagreement with party officials in the Northwest, where somehow what they found out that he had been, threatened with disciplinary measures
Yeah,
by Communist Party leadership during the Spanish Civil War. It just
right,
wasn't Americans, the American
right,
leadership.
right. Oh my gosh, it's just so rich, And I
Yeah,
think the other thing, so his fearlessness comes through in the one year, how he tells the story, the one year he's abroad from 37, 38. His fearlessness, his resourcefulness, but also his bravery. So,
right.
he has to transport people and supplies, and at one point, food. Um, I believe it's in the Ebro campaign. And
Garbanzo beans, no doubt.
well, and so he's driving, and this road that's covered with snipers, so it's very dangerous. And he has to drive really fast. And part of the time he's going back on foot, so he knows this area really well. He walks the trench next to the road, so he's cased the joint again very thoroughly so that he can make a success of this task. And even at one point, he says that they loaded up. The men hadn't eaten in 24 hours. They load this truck with these big stew pots full of donkey stew. They had cut up some of the work animals to make food for not even garbanzos, right? We're starting to really see the shortages that the Republicans faced. Anyway, and so he's driving like a bat out of hell on this truck. He's got some guys in the back that are trying to hold the pots steady so they don't spill. And they're being shot at through the back of the truck.
Right.
The bullets are going through the windshield, and some of the bullets hit the pots. And so the guys are in the back of the truck with their hands up
He's
against
on
the
the pot.
pots so that they don't leak out the stew for the poor guys on the front line who are hungry. I mean, to me, it's just made for the
Very
movies. I
close.
mean, it's
Right.
quite something. And in fact, he says, he obviously survived, and he thought he got glass in his body from the shattering of the
Mhm.
windshield. But I think it turned out to be shrapnel, and he was
Right.
taken to the hospital for treatment after that. Is that a story that you heard pieces of at all? So that was
No,
news to you when you heard the oral history.
No, I know. I knew about stealing the trucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did
But
too.
I didn't know, about his exploits as a driver.
Yeah.
I think
Was he a scary driver at home? Were you guys afraid to get in the car?
I know he was a great driver.
he was aggressive, but he was good driver.
Did he teach you
Yeah.
to drive?
Yes.
Um,
Yes, David?
I would say
well,
yes.
I taught
David
myself how
taught
to
himself to drive, which actually turned out to be a very good thing at one point after Fred and I had left home, and Daddy, who was working as a cabinet maker, injured himself on a piece of his equipment. And
Oh,
David was underage, under licensed, but able to drive him to the hospital.
I did.
wow.
I don't
Yep,
remember that.
that's the story I heard.
I don't remember that.
So, he kind of has to wrap up, Alvin has to wrap up his service. He hasn't been able to serve as a soldier and he gets sick. So apparently, as he tells it, as you know, he got several bouts of hepatitis,
Right.
which was both serious and I think contagious, right? So he is sent home, and he used a fair number of Spanish words along the way in the interview. He says he was designated inútil,
Right.
not
Useless.
useful, useless, and kind of has to go home. And again, not only does he have hepatitis, but he's got other injuries from gun battle. And so your earlier recounting of the care that he needed when he got home, is underscored by the shape he was in at the end of in 1938 when he did come back to the States. And then, of course, when World War II rolls around and he goes to sign up, he's initially designated F4, which is physically um, unable to serve. So I wonder if you want to tell, I know there's a lot to say about his service in World War II, particularly his efforts to initially get into the Army. I wonder if you want to
So,
begin to unpack
well,
that layered
initially,
story.
initially party leaders were not encouraging people to volunteer to go to Europe, but about half of the Spanish Civil War vets were Jews,
Right.
and they were quite aware of what was going on in Europe. I mean, if they were aware of Spain, they were certainly aware of what was going on in Europe. And they were, staunch anti-fascists. So they
Right.
volunteered. And when he volunteered, um, it came to some higher ups' attention that he had military experience.
Right.
And his commanding officer for that facility told my father that he should go to officer training school. And this is where, I mean, Daddy said, I don't want any part of being leadership. I mean, he was really, I want to be an ordinary soldier.
Right.
And he was then ordered to volunteer for officer training. And then was put on a train to shipped out to go for training. And he found himself on a series of train rides, this time riding, as they say, the cushions, rather
Ah,
than the blinds, because
right,
it was
right, right.
official. And after, a couple of times of going from base to base and then just being put back on another train, he broke into his orders. And he found out that he had been classified as SD,
Yep.
suspect disloyal,
Right.
and the cause was premature anti-fascist, officially.
Right.
And he ended up in Indiana, I think, in a military base with other Spanish Civil War vets and other and German Americans and Italian Americans who had also volunteered to fight. And they were being held there. I must have gotten, I don't know whether he got any basic training there.
Right. No, I just keep saying he's been
And
denied of his basic training.
right. And then he sort of waged a personal war with some other guys to try to get to Europe. And so at one point he went AWOL, and went to Washington to talk to Drew Pearson, a famous journalist. And somewhere in one of my boxes, I actually have the clipping of Drew Pearson writing about these guys who have military experience who are not being allowed to serve.
Right. Right.
And so eventually, as Daddy put it, his commanding officer said that if they would stop writing letters they could go, he would ship them overseas, since apparently they managed to conceal the fact that they were going AWOL. And
Wow.
so the story goes that he ends up in England, sitting next to another Spanish Civil War vet, working on secret military plans, which are the plans for D-Day.
Wow.
And they look at each other and they say, if anything goes wrong with this operation, they're going to shoot us.
Mm.
So they went to their commanding officer and said, we don't want any part of your secret plans. We just want to fight the fascists.
Wow.
And so he was assigned to um, a, a
The
unit
engineers
that
group.
an engineers group. Yeah, in I can't remember it was at the 89th. I can't remember the name of the actual unit, but it was called
Got
the
it.
Blue and the Gray because it had both northern and southern units, but he was with a southern unit.
How interesting.
And he landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day -1 hour. He was in a group that was sent in an hour ahead of the main advance
My
with
God.
giant clippers to cut the barbed wire that the Germans had laid under the water to protect themselves. If you recall the history, it was a very stormy sea,
Right.
and the
Very, very.
boats, the landing gear couldn't get close enough to the shore. And so a lot of the people who never even made it to shore, they drowned because their equipment was so heavy. And Daddy, in addition to having military experience, had been a long distance swimmer. And he shed his gear and swam to shore and equipped himself from a corpse. And
Mm.
that's how he survived the fusillade.
Yeah.
And the only thing I remember beyond that, I mean, and we did at one point when I was living in France, we made a pilgrimage to Omaha Beach to the area where he landed, which was
Wow.
quite impressive. Was that they were then told that there was just a small cleanup operation that they had to do after Omaha Beach, and that was the battle for Normandy. Um,
Remarkable.
yeah.
So eventually he uh, wound up all the way to the Elbe River at the
Mm.
end of his service, spent the winter of 44 very near where the Battle of the Bulge was.
Wow.
But when he was in Normandy with this southern unit, they would be crawling across the fields, and one of them would say, "I smell hooch," because there were underground vats for aging Calvados. And
Ah,
Oh,
Daddy
great.
had more than his fill of Calvados. Um, which he
wow.
would never, that was another thing that he would never touch for the rest of his life.
Wow.
Yeah, but it was most definitely a southern unit.
Yeah.
Um, and
Very
and he
interesting.
somehow managed to survive that because there were enormous casualties in that battle as well.
Of course. Of course.
So
And was he decorated for his World War II service?
did he? I think he had a Purple Heart. I'm not sure.
Purple Heart is Maury.
And
He
how
was
did
given the responsibility at the end of the war to educate his fellow soldiers about why the war was fought when they were sort of, yeah.
Wow.
When they were preparing, apparently what they did was they held them there and prepared them for reentry. So that's, I think, where he learned some of his carpentry skills. And
Interesting.
then higher ups found out that the version that he was teaching them was rather more political than they would have preferred. So that was
Wow.
another one of his brief stints as a teacher.
That is
I mean,
just
despite
so
the fact that
powerful.
he dropped out of school, he was a born teacher.
Hmm. Well, I just was at a talk last night and was reminded that George Washington assigned Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet for his troops to read
Oh, that's
during,
interesting.
so that they would, because there's so much going on in battle, just sort of why we fight, why are you doing this? Why
Yeah.
is this important? And of course, my mother's story of leaving Spain in the 50s under Franco, she had to go through indoctrinization school. There was a catechism you had to learn, and it was a very intimidating process. But this the role of propaganda in wartime and in this epic mid 20th century struggle, right, with fascism, that's very powerful. How did you learn about that? Is that in the oral history, or did that come through at the kitchen table that he had this job as a teacher of his fellow soldiers in World War II.
My sense is that I learned it in one of the oral histories. I mean, one
Yeah,
where it's somewhere in a box in a storage compartment somewhere. I think
fair
I have
enough.
a thick sheaf of from of a, although it may be in the Alba archives, an oral history interview
Yeah,
that was done with him. I don't remember him telling that story per se, but it's because we heard these stories also when Daddy and Maury and Arthur, I mean, our two uncles, were sharing stories, or when the other vets were visiting. It's hard to know what we heard because we overheard it. We also went annually to Vets Affairs. There were a reunion.
right.
So it's hard to distinguish those
Sure.
stories, from ones that were told in the house
Yeah, sure,
or
sure.
to us
Understandable.
specifically. I remember when I was in college, I went with my parents down to Virginia to go to Colonial Williamsburg. And Daddy told a lot of stories on that trip. So
Mm,
I mean, there were a bunch of, and I said I was old enough that I think he told stuff that he probably wouldn't have told us when we were little.
right. And long car rides are good for that.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been so rich. I think maybe by way of beginning to wrap up, maybe we could just go around and have each of you share, what, your favorite Alvin story, one of the lessons or legacies you feel you carry from, both your parents, but, perhaps with an accent on your dad a little bit or the Spanish part of the story. Just love to give you each, the time to really share something that's important to you about his legacy.
Mm.
Well, I would like, and I said this last time, I just remember, I don't remember how old I was, but I remember, being sat down, and I think it was both of them. I'm
Mm,
not really sure, but I think it was both of them. And they just explained to me basically that all people are the same, to have empathy, and, they just, to be a good person in this world. I remember that. And having absolutely nothing to do with it and a total segue, I remember him being in a fist fight in traffic one time. I never.
wow. So hopping out of the car.
Yes, on the river on Riverside Drive.
Yeah. Yeah, he had a temper.
That is something
He was
else.
contentious.
That is something else. Well, he also kind of knew how to fight. I mean, this is the thing he also shares in his oral history that his friends knew how to box. They knew how to defend themselves. And, it's one more tool to get through this world. Thank you
And
for that.
he did buy me a pair of boxing gloves when I was young. I suppose he must have given me a little instruction. I really don't recall, but I don't know. I'm sure I take after my father in some respects. Connie says that I'm controlling,
I do.
but yeah, but we didn't always agree.
Yeah.
And I spent the better part of the decade of my 20s being involved in left-wing politics, but it wasn't the same variety or brand that he was. So uh, we didn't. We didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but I followed in his footsteps in a sense in that regard.
So would you say it kind of his example gave you the courage to stand by your beliefs? Sounds like.
Yeah, I would say so.
Was
Yeah.
he, one of the, I think you're referring to the 60s. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there was the anti-war movement did not go down well with veterans. Is that
Hmm.
is that a piece of the story for you?
No, my involvement was more in the 70s,
Yeah,
so
fair
it
enough.
was after that, and
But he was continually involved. Anti-Vietnam War, Angela Davis. I know he spent a lot of time on the Angela Davis thing. He was continually and constantly involved.
Wow.
Really, there's an organization in Ossining, called Westpac, Westchester Peace People's Action Coalition or something. I can't remember what it exactly stands for, but he's one of the co-founders of that.
Oh, wow.
And was honored for that. I mean, it's interesting that David has a specific memory of mommy and daddy sitting him down, where I think for Fred and for me, it was interwoven in daily life, that there were lessons. I mean, and they weren't just political and ethical lessons. I mean, daddy would teach you nature lessons. You go for a walk and he would point out things in nature. But and he and I also didn't see eye to eye, and I found years later that I had his letters and my drafts, and he had my letters and his drafts there, when we sort of came to an agreement of how we were going to move forward in discussing politics. But
unsent drafts, right? Unsent, but
right, both of us sort of struggling with how to say to each other what we needed to say,
that's the point.
in order to come to a way that we could have conversations without yelling at each other. So, but he was an incredible role model, but he was also a lot of fun. I mean, he played games. We grew up with cards and Scrabble and anagrams and stupid jokes at the dinner table, and he took us. We went every year to Coney Island, to go to an amusement park, and nobody loved the bumper cars more than Daddy did. I mean, he was this really interesting character, and I think all of us have, in different ways, played out the commitment to improving the world in our own lives. I mean, I spent my life working on education reform in the not-for-profit world, and now in retirement I'm working pretty much nonstop on immigration-related issues with our local Indivisible chapter. And I sometimes wonder what he would have to say about what's going on now. I wonder about what mommy would have to say too. I mean, they were both just deeply ethical and political human beings.
Yeah. Well, I think our time today is yet one more meaningful, I hope to you, but certainly to me, tribute to your father, Alvin Warren and Anna Warren, née Hamberger. My guests today have been Connie Warren, Fred Warren, and David Warren. This has been Family Secrets of the Spanish Civil War. We have been sharing and enjoying learning about Alvin Warren, who served in the Spanish Civil War, part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades in 1937 and 38. It has been an honor to talk with you today. I want to thank you so much for your gracious sharing of your time and your memories of your remarkable parents, your remarkable family. And I really look forward to sharing this podcast far and wide. Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
For the opportunity.